There's a moment that happens to some people late at night. A moment so quiet, it almost feels unreal. You're scrolling through your phone in the dark, your face lit by artificial light. You see photos of people crowded around dinner tables, inside cars, at weddings, laughing in blurry motion like life is happening somewhere else without you. And for a second, your chest tightens. Not because you hate them, not because you're jealous, but because you suddenly realize something terrifying. No one is looking for you. No message waiting. No, where are you? No one wondering why you disappeared. And the silence in your room begins to feel heavier than the walls themselves. So you tell yourself stories. You say people are fake now. You say nobody understands depth anymore. You say you're just different, too aware, too emotionally intelligent for shallow friendships. But deep down, there's another possibility you avoid looking at, a possibility so uncomfortable that most people spend their entire lives running from it. What if loneliness isn't something happening to you? What if it's something your nervous system quietly learned to create? Because the strangest thing about human beings is that we don't always push people away with anger. Sometimes we push them away with silence, with self-protection, with the invisible walls we don't even realize we're building. And tonight, we're going to talk about the truth no one tells you about having no friends. Not the comfortable truth, the real one. The one hidden underneath your personality, your habits, your childhood, and the version of yourself you had to become just to survive. There's something almost haunting about the way loneliness changes your memory. You stop remembering relationships clearly. You start remembering them symbolically. The friend who slowly drifted away becomes proof that nobody stays. The unanswered message becomes evidence that you're forgettable. The one betrayal from years ago quietly rewrites your entire understanding of trust. And after enough pain, your brain stops asking, "What happened?" It starts asking, "What's wrong with me?" That question is dangerous, because once a human being internalizes loneliness as identity instead of circumstance, they begin unconsciously participating in their own isolation. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but psychologically. You start entering interactions already expecting disconnection, and expectation changes behavior in ways most people never notice. You speak less, reveal less, risk less. You become emotionally economical. You only show pieces of yourself you believe are acceptable, manageable, non-threatening. And at first it feels smart. But over time you begin starving people of the very thing that creates closeness, emotional texture. Think about the people you feel closest to in life. It's rarely because they were perfect. It's because they were real, in a way that made you lower your own armor. Maybe they admitted insecurity without disguising it as humor. Maybe they confessed something embarrassing without collapsing from shame. Maybe they allowed themselves to be emotionally visible without trying to control your perception of them every second. That's what creates emotional gravity. Not performance, not status, not perfection. Permission. And lonely people often don't realize they've become addicted to controlling perception. You replay conversations after they end. You monitor your tone. You calculate whether you sounded annoying, awkward, needy, too quiet, too intense. Meanwhile, the other person may have barely analyzed the interaction at all. But your nervous system treats social connection like survival. Because somewhere along the way, acceptance stopped feeling natural and started feeling earned. So now every interaction feels like a test you can fail. And this creates one of the saddest psychological loops in modern life. The more badly you want connection, the more self-conscious you become around people. The more self-conscious you become, the less natural you behave. And the less natural you behave, the harder authentic connection becomes. So you leave interactions feeling unseen, while never realizing people were mostly meeting your defense mechanisms instead of you. That's why some people can sit in a crowded room and still feel profoundly alone, because proximity is not intimacy. You can spend years around people while remaining emotionally unreachable. And eventually, loneliness begins mutating into something darker. Resentment. Not loud resentment, quiet resentment. The kind that whispers things like, "Nobody really cares. People only value entertaining personalities. Everyone already has their group. What's the point of trying?" But underneath resentment is usually grief. Grief for the version of yourself that once believed connection would happen naturally. As children, most of us assumed friendship would simply continue forever. You sit next to someone in class, you laugh together 3 times, and suddenly you belong to each other's world. But adulthood becomes colder. People become cautious, wounded, distracted, exhausted. And if you already carry hidden fears of rejection, modern life amplifies them mercilessly. Social media makes everyone appear socially fulfilled. Group photos become psychological weapons. Even silence becomes interpretive. You start comparing your private emptiness to everyone else's public highlight reel. And eventually, you begin disappearing before anyone can reject you directly. You decline invitations, delay responses, convince yourself you're tired when you're actually afraid. Afraid of awkwardness, afraid of irrelevance, afraid of discovering you matter less to people than they matter to you. So isolation slowly becomes familiar, predictable. And human beings will always choose familiar pain over unfamiliar vulnerability, even if that familiar pain is loneliness. That's the part nobody wants to admit. Loneliness can become an identity people protect. Because if you convince yourself nobody understands you, you never have to risk truly being understood. If you convince yourself people always leave, you never have to fully lean on someone and discover whether they'll stay. And if you stay emotionally hidden long enough, eventually your isolation stops feeling like a problem. It starts feeling like your personality. But there's a deeper layer beneath all of this, a layer most people never examine. Because sometimes the reason you have no close friends has nothing to do with social skill. Sometimes it's because your entire life has been built around emotional survival instead of emotional presence. And the difference between those two things changes everything. Survival mode is strange. It doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks responsible, productive, independent. Sometimes it looks like the person who never asks for help, the one who handles everything alone, the one everybody relies on emotionally, while nobody realizes they're quietly drowning. Because when a person grows up adapting to instability, criticism, neglect, or emotional unpredictability, they often become hyper-attuned to the emotional atmosphere around them. You learn to read rooms before speaking. You learn to anticipate reactions before expressing yourself. You learn that safety comes from monitoring other people instead of inhabiting yourself. And eventually, you stop living socially as a human being. You start living socially as a radar system, always scanning, always adjusting, always calculating. That's exhausting. But worse than exhausting, it disconnects you from spontaneity, and spontaneity is where intimacy lives. Real connection is messy, unscripted, imperfect. It requires the ability to exist without constantly managing the outcome. But people trapped in survival mode struggle with this deeply, not because they're cold, because they're afraid. Afraid of becoming too much, too emotional, too honest, too needy, too visible. So they compress themselves into emotionally acceptable versions, smaller versions, safer versions, versions designed not to disturb anyone. And over time, this self-erasure becomes automatic. You stop noticing how often you silence yourself mid-sentence, how often you laugh when something actually hurt you, how often you pretend not to care simply because caring feels dangerous. You become emotionally fluent in everyone except yourself. And here's the terrifying part. The world often rewards this behavior. People praise your calmness, your maturity, your independence. But what they're sometimes praising is your disconnection from your own needs. Because emotionally self-abandoning people are often extremely convenient to others. You don't ask for reassurance. You don't create conflict. You don't take up emotional space. You become easy to keep around, but difficult to deeply know. And eventually, an invisible resentment begins forming inside you. Not because others failed you completely, but because part of you realizes you've spent years shape-shifting for acceptance, while secretly hoping someone would notice the pain underneath. Only most people won't notice what you never reveal. That realization hurts. A lot. Because there comes a moment where you understand something heartbreaking. People can only connect with the version of you that you allow to exist in front of them. And if you've spent your entire life performing composure, people will relate to your composure, not your loneliness, not your fear, not the exhausted person underneath the mask wondering why nobody truly sees them. This is why some people feel profoundly empty even while surrounded by acquaintances. Because being socially included is not the same as being emotionally known. And emotional starvation creates strange symptoms. You stop feeling excitement around people. Conversations begin feeling transactional. You start assuming every connection is temporary before it even begins. Some lonely people become quieter. Others become performers. They become the funniest person in the room, the smartest, the most interesting. Because if they can't be loved for who they are, maybe they can at least be valued for what they provide. Humor, insight, entertainment, emotional labor. But eventually performance creates exhaustion. Because deep down, every human being wants one terrifying thing: to be loved without having to earn their right to exist first. And if you've never experienced that consistently, relationships begin feeling like emotional employment. You become useful instead of known, needed instead of understood, present instead of connected. And somewhere inside you, a quiet grief starts growing for the person you could have been if you had felt emotionally safe earlier in life. Maybe you would have been louder, softer, more trusting, more playful. Maybe you wouldn't overthink every text message like it carries the weight of your worth. Maybe closeness wouldn't feel like a risk. But unresolved loneliness changes your relationship with yourself. You start seeing your existence through imagined judgment. Even when nobody is attacking you, you assume people are tolerating you instead of choosing you. You interpret emotional distance before it even exists. You brace for abandonment long before anyone leaves. And eventually, you begin living as if rejection is inevitable. That's what survival mode does. It teaches you to prepare for pain so constantly that you accidentally become unavailable to joy, unavailable to unpredictability, unavailable to intimacy. Because intimacy requires surrender. Not complete surrender to another person, but surrender to being seen without total control over the outcome. And most chronically lonely people aren't actually afraid of people. They're afraid of exposure. Afraid that if someone finally looked closely enough, they'd discover something unlovable underneath. But the final truth beneath all of this is even more unsettling. Because the deepest loneliness often has nothing to do with other people at all. It begins with the relationship between you and the parts of yourself you abandon just to survive. At some point, loneliness stops being about who isn't in your life. It becomes about who disappeared inside you. And that's the truth almost nobody wants to face. Because it's easier to blame the world. Easier to say people are shallow, cruel, disconnected. And sometimes they are. But there are also moments when the person abandoning you most consistently has been you. Not consciously, but quietly. Every time you swallowed a feeling before it could inconvenience someone. Every time you pretended something didn't hurt. Every time you edited your personality to remain acceptable. Every time you betrayed your own emotional reality just to avoid rejection. Piece by piece, you drifted away from yourself. And the terrifying thing about self-abandonment is that it often looks like adaptation while it's happening. You call it maturity, discipline, independence. But deep inside, another part of you keeps waiting. Waiting for permission to exist fully. The part of you that once spoke freely before shame interrupted it. The part that wanted connection without strategy. The part that didn't rehearse every sentence before speaking. That version is not gone, just buried underneath years of emotional survival. And survival changes people in invisible ways. It teaches you to become emotionally negotiable. You start adjusting your personality depending on who you're around. You soften truths to avoid discomfort. You hide enthusiasm because being fully expressive feels unsafe. You detach before people can disappoint you. And after years of doing this, you wake up one day with a strange feeling. Nobody really knows you. Not completely. Not because you're impossible to love, but because the real you rarely arrived. Only fragments, curated versions, emotionally filtered pieces. And human beings can sense that distance even when they can't explain it. They feel the hesitation, the guardedness, the invisible wall behind your eyes. Because connection is not created through proximity. It's created through emotional risk. That's why two strangers can speak for 1 hour and feel deeply understood, while lifelong friends can remain emotionally miles apart. One person chose honesty, the other chose performance. And performance is seductive because it protects you from immediate pain. But it also prevents deep belonging. Because belonging requires something most lonely people secretly fear: being witnessed without control. No image management, no emotional disguise, No carefully engineered personality. Just truth. Raw truth. The kind that trembles slightly when spoken. I feel forgotten sometimes. I don't know how to let people close. I act detached when I actually care deeply. I'm scared people won't choose me if they really know me. Those sentences terrify people not because they're weak, but because they dismantle the illusion of invulnerability. And invulnerability is often the final fortress of lonely people. You convince yourself you don't need anyone. You romanticize isolation. You become proud of how little you ask from others. But the body always tells the truth eventually. In the exhaustion you can't explain, in the numbness after social interactions, in the ache you feel watching other people experience effortless closeness. Because human beings were never designed to merely be observed. They were designed to be known. Not admired from a distance, not tolerated, known. And the moment you finally understand this, something begins to shift. You realize friendship was never purely about finding the right people. It was also about becoming emotionally reachable. Not perfect, not endlessly confident, reachable. Because there are people in this world who could love you deeply, who could understand you in ways you can't even imagine yet, but they cannot connect with a version of you built entirely out of defense mechanisms. At some point, the mask that protected you starts suffocating you. And maybe that's where your life changes. Not in some dramatic transformation, not overnight, but quietly. In the moment you stop treating vulnerability like danger. In the moment you answer honestly when someone asks how you are. In the moment you stop performing strength and allow yourself to be human in front of another human being. That's where loneliness begins to crack. Not because the world suddenly changes, but because you finally stop hiding from it. And maybe the saddest part of all this is realizing how many years you spent believing nobody wanted you, when the real tragedy was that nobody ever truly got the chance to meet you. Most people think friendship begins with attraction, common interests, shared humor, chemistry, timing. But that's not where friendship actually begins. Friendship begins with emotional permission, and some people never learned how to give that permission away. You can see it in small moments. Someone asks how you're doing and you automatically say, "I'm fine." Not because you are fine, but because something inside you learned long ago that honesty feels dangerous. Someone gets close to you, and instead of relaxing, your body subtly tightens. You become more careful, more edited, more performative. You start speaking from the surface instead of the center. And eventually, people leave conversations with the strange feeling that they met you, without ever actually reaching you. That's the part nobody explains. Lonely people are often deeply lovable, deeply intelligent, deeply sensitive. But sensitivity without safety becomes concealment, and concealment destroys connection. Because human beings don't bond through perfection, they bond through revealed humanity. The problem is, somewhere in your life, being fully seen may have come with consequences. Maybe vulnerability was mocked in your home. Maybe your emotions were inconvenient to the people raising you. Maybe you learned that expressing need made you weak. Maybe the people you trusted disappeared when you finally opened up. So your nervous system adapted. It became strategic. You learned how to stay emotionally half-hidden while physically present. You became the listener instead of the speaker, the observer instead of the participant, the easygoing one who never asks for too much. And at first, this adaptation feels intelligent. You avoid rejection. You avoid embarrassment. You avoid dependence. But over time, something devastating begins to happen. Your relationships become emotionally asymmetrical. People talk to you, but don't know you. They enjoy your presence, but never feel invited into your inner world. They assume you're emotionally self-sufficient because you trained yourself to appear that way. So eventually, they stop reaching deeper. Not because you're unworthy of connection, but because human beings unconsciously mirror emotional openness. If you lock every door inside yourself, people eventually stop knocking. And the cruel irony is that the lonelier you become, the harder authenticity starts to feel. Because isolation changes your psychology. After enough loneliness, even kindness begins to feel suspicious. You overanalyze delayed replies. You rehearse texts before sending them. You interpret neutral expressions as rejection. You convince yourself you're unwanted before anyone gets the chance to choose you. And then something subtle happens. You stop entering rooms as yourself. You enter as a defense mechanism. Some people become hyper-funny. Some become emotionally detached. Some become intellectually intimidating. Some become invisible. But almost all chronic loneliness shares one hidden trait: self-protection disguised as personality. And most people never notice it. They simply say things like, "I don't really connect with people," without realizing their entire nervous system is organized around preventing connection before it can threaten them. Because connection is terrifying when your past taught you that closeness eventually becomes pain. So instead of risking abandonment, you master emotional self-containment. You become independent, private, hard to read, and everyone praises you for it. They call you mature, calm, low maintenance, while quietly never realizing how much of your inner life remains untouched by another human being. That's the tragedy. Some of the loneliest people on earth don't look lonely at all. They look composed. But composure is not connection. And eventually, late at night, the performance exhausts you, because there is a version of you underneath all the restraint, a version starving to be witnessed without editing itself first, a version that wants to speak before calculating, to laugh without monitoring the volume, to admit fear without feeling ashamed of it. But the longer you live hidden, the more foreign that version begins to feel. And this is where the real question begins. Because maybe your loneliness isn't about people rejecting you. Maybe it's about the fact that the real you has been missing from every room you ever entered. And once you realize that, you start seeing another pattern that's even harder to confront.